If I'm running a business, I'm loving people, I'm caring for my neighbor, I'm giving glory to God, I'm dying to self, I'm running a company like that. But you're swimming against the current. And if you go back to our 2x2, the upper right hand, I normally show arrows going left to right. And whenever you're in the upper right quadrant, to go to the left hurts because you're always conceding something. And we were all trained in colleges and business schools that what you really want to do is take the least amount of risk over the shortest period of time for the highest return. If you can get a 20% IRR and it's even short, that's great. And what redemptive investing is just the opposite of that. You're taking higher risks over longer periods of time for expected lower financial returns. And some people say that's just bad investing.
Well, hello there, and welcome back to the Generosity Now podcast, where we bring you inspiring stories of generosity and whole life stewardship. My name's Jonathan Collier, and I'm the podcast producer here on the Generosity Now podcast. And I have the opportunity to fill in for Eric and Lori while they're taking some time off this summer and preparing for an exciting fall launch of Season 3 of the podcast. So in the coming weeks, as you're spending time with your families this summer, we wanted to bring some of our earlier episodes in Season 2 back to the forefront. We've got some great stories lined up. Whether you've heard these before or you're a brand new listener and you're just now discovering the Generosity Now podcast, we hope that these conversations will inspire you to live a life of generosity now and to dive deeper into the meanings of whole life stewardship. As always, we hope you enjoyed this episode and the ones to follow, and be sure to stick around to the end. Now, on to today's podcast.
Well, today we have Greg Lernihan on today's episode. Thanks for joining us. Really do appreciate you being here.
Honored to be here, Eric and Lori. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, well, Greg is committed to making a positive difference in the lives of others and has refocused his life with this purpose. As a faith-based investor, Greg dedicates his time and talents to mentoring and investing in for-profit businesses that address the world's greatest social challenges. Greg is dedicated to helping others who are passionately changing the world. He seeks to partner with Christ-centered leaders that produce spiritual, social, and financial returns by serving the less fortunate in Chicago and internationally. Just taking a peek at Greg's bio, we see that you show up time and time and time again as an investor with many incredible organizations. But that isn't where you got started. So, Greg, would you give our listeners an overview of who you are, where you were raised, how you came to know Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and a bit about your family and the scope of work you've done over the years?
I was born and raised in a beautiful small town called Michigan City, Indiana, which is on the border of Indiana and Michigan, to two incredible Christian parents. So I was blessed with that. I grew up in a Christian family. I was baptized as an infant, was a churchgoer every Sunday and did all that. But I probably wasn't fulfilling the full Christian life my whole life. And so somewhere about 15 years ago, I became more of a seeker and was active in my faith. I was always believed in God, not an issue. I always believed Jesus was my Savior, but that I would say that Jesus wasn't in the driver's seat. He was maybe in the back seat, in the passenger seat back there. And so about 15 years ago, put a lot of effort into reading the Bible, becoming more active in my faith. And then we had a wealth event, what professional wealth advisors call when you sell a portion of your company and one day your bank account has more money than you expected. They call that a wealth event. And that changed us fairly significantly in that we started to say, now what are we supposed to do to steward the resources that God's entrusted with us? So my wife actually went back to school and got a master's in biblical studies from Wheaton College to try to help us know from God's perspective. And I joined small men's group, read very detailed on the Bible, attended conferences. And so I would say now 15 years later, God is driving our lives. We are passionately following him. The Bible is an integral part. I think Mary Beth and I talk about God conservatively every day, all day, it seems like. So God has become an important part. It's funny how much the Bible's impacted us. I would candidly have thought 20 years ago it just wasn't relevant to today's world. And I would say just the opposite now, Eric. It's the most relevant book we have. And my mother-in-law gave us a Bible 20-some years ago. And she put a little card on the inside of the Bible that says, no matter how much success you both may have, this is where you'll find your treasure. And we put that in our kids, gave them a Bible and put that in. And it's probably the most profound thing that an outside person ever said to us. And it took us 20 years to even appreciate what that meant. And on the career side, Eric, I worked for a building technology firm for about 20 years in various leadership capacities. I was very blessed with responsibilities for North America and things like that. And then after 20 years, a co-founder, a colleague, friend named Dan Masseri and I decided to start a company from the basement of a house, which is one of the more challenging things I've done in my life. And we started an electronic security integration company, which I know means nothing to your audience, I'm sure. But basically, we design, service, and install security systems like card access and cameras and all the stuff you see on TV. And only through the grace of God, that business has done incredibly well. And so 11 years ago, I decided to leave day-to-day responsibilities, stayed on the board, investor, and things like that. But I dedicate my time now to stewarding the resources God had entrusted with us the last 11 years.
Greg, we often talk about our lives being journeys, and you just shared a lot about what a journey this has been with God. But boy, those last 15 to 11 years, that was pretty fast journeying there, of going from really putting God in the driver's seat to then stepping away and now stewarding in this place. What a story.
I wish I could point to one day, Lori, and I can't. It was my wife and I are on a spiritual path together, which is what's great. We sit here now having resources. When I call resources, I'm talking about time, talent, and treasure, and saying, Lord, first thing in the morning, what do you want us to do with these resources? How can we best steward them? And my mind was not there probably in the early days. I was a 90-10. I never had a problem with tithing. I cheated in that I only tithed of net income. I didn't think God understood the tax system. And I said, nobody's doing 10% of gross. I don't want to be the only person out there. And so we as a family, I can't believe my wife let me do this because she's way better than I am. And we did 10% of our net income for our whole entire lives. And then we had this wealth event, and 10% is not sacrificial. And so it took us down a different path now, which is the Lord saying, now these are, my resources, and we'll talk some about that. And that changed us pretty dramatically, Lori.
I'm thankful for God's grace and how he helps us as we progress. And it's a journey for all of us, and that's what
I thought it was a destination is what's really sad, is I thought I was going to arrive. And what I've learned, unfortunately, is the more I learn, the more I don't know. And the farther that road goes out. And I thought I could master it quicker than I have.
Yeah. Greg, you talk about in 2012 you took a mission trip to Haiti, and that, along with, I'm assuming this journey, as we put in the time, 20 years, 21 years ago for that, that had a huge impact on that. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, it was back in 2010 when Haiti had their really significant earthquake, and so it was on the news a lot. And I have no idea to this day, other than the Holy Spirit, why Haiti was on my mind. And so I went to some of our leaders in our company, Convergent, and said, I want to lead a trip to Haiti. And if you think some colleagues will go with me? And they're like, nobody's going to go with you. And so I put out a quick text, or actually it was an email, and said, we're going to go either to Joplin, Missouri, where a tornado had hit, and that would be a nice, safe place to go. We can drive there. We can fly our commercial planes, stay at decent hotels, eat at places we're familiar with, or we can go to Haiti, which is not a great place. Don't know where we're spending the night. And to my surprise and actually excitement, many overwhelmingly wrote me saying, I want to be on that trip. I want to be on that trip. And so we ended up going to Haiti, and I took 31 colleagues. We had a lot more that wanted to go, but that's all we could handle in the buses and vans. And I would say from the time you land, Eric, back then especially, it was a developing country airport at best. It was, when you were on the ground, you knew exactly you weren't in the States anymore. And I had never traveled to a developing country. This was my first trip, and I was wrecked. It's not like watching CNN and you can see it, you can turn it off. When you're there and the smells and the scenes and the tarps and no one has jobs, it's literally overwhelming. I wouldn't even know what to do if someone came to me. I read recently that I think it's $13 billion has been poured into Haiti from Grant Capital, and you really can't point to a lot being done there. And when I was there, if someone gave me $13 billion, I wouldn't even know where to start because the problems are so overwhelming, from electrical to safety to infrastructure to plumbing. It just never ends. And so it changed the way I thought about life, and that maybe some of your audience members have read the book Halftime, which talks about going around the age of 40 or about halfway through your life. You're going from success to significance. And Convergent was wildly successful. And I remember being in Haiti going, is that all there is? There can't be. There can't be that. And so I felt called then to go do something more purposeful. And that's the charter I've been on. And one of the quotes that got to me was from Joseph Stalin that said, a single death is a tragedy. Hold on a second. A single death is a tragedy, but a million is a statistic. So just stop and think about that because it drives me. If we knew there were 100 people starving in Haiti, I think we could solve the problem. But once you hear that there's 10 million, you don't know what to do with it. It's so overwhelming. And so I saw ones and twos and threes, not millions. And so you felt like you could do something. And so that's when I left day to day. We sold a majority interest of our company at that same time. So the Lord blessed us with some capital. And then we said, okay, Lord, what do you want us to do with this? And that's when our journey on the investing, faith-driven side started.
So fantastic. I consistently hear the impact with givers that we talk with, and also folks on the podcast of a mission trip outside of the context of the world, and how that can have such an absolute significant impact on you, the individual. As we think about the book Helping Hurts, and a lot of times when we go, it's actually not to actually help, it's actually more for ourselves. And I love, though, how God has done incredible work in and through you and many others when we leave the comfort of our home, the comfort of our surroundings, and go to hard places. And then God can use that to truly change the trajectory of our entire life. It's really a beautiful thing to see.
I would agree, Eric, and it was outside my comfort zone at every level. The way accommodations weren't great to sleep, food wasn't great, the environment was tough, but that made the trip. And I'm so thankful that I got on that plane, although I was nervous, I would tell you, because I had responsibility for the colleagues as well. And Haiti's in a really bad place right now. I read Toxic Charity and When Helping Hurts, and we did everything wrong that they said don't do on a trip. And they were right. They were right. I went back on multiple trips and we changed it. But at the core, and they did question whether it's worth a week or 10 days, one of those trips. In my case and others that I'm around, it was life-changing. But I understand how it can be looked, you just pop in and you leave and you try to save the day. That was not our intent. And the Lord changed my outlook on life. And so if I hadn't gone, it was a pivotal moment for me and my family.
That's awesome. Yeah, at some point we'll have to have a conversation on my first trip to Haiti, being chased away, almost chased away in the middle of the night by a guy with machetes because we were staying at a place that evidently we weren't supposed to, even though we were told, and the visceral feeling that you have. But I feel you there. But you kind of came back, and with that, you had this liquidity event with Convergent. And you're now actually sitting as the chairman of the Impact Foundation. And we've talked about impact investing on the podcast before, and we've talked about the Impact Foundation. Listeners, in fact, if you'd like an overview of impact investing, go back and listen to episode 9, which is titled, What is Impact Investing? But would you give our listeners an overview of the work of the Impact Foundation specifically, and why you're partnering with them?
Yes. And just to be factual, given when we're doing this podcast, I just stepped down from being chair of Impact Foundation the last couple of months. I've been the chair for 5, 6 years and 7 years, whatever it is. And I'm thrilled to be part of the organization, but we rotated off. And so still on the board, still committed. Impact Foundation is a nonprofit that's set up to help deploy charitable capital for good in the world, which means if you have a donor advised fund like we did or do, and I wanted to invest, let's say, in Africa, I cannot invest that capital. I can grant it, but I can't invest that capital in for-profit businesses. And Impact Foundation is that intermediary to where you grant it to them and they invest it for you. And then when the funds go up, let's say you put in $25,000 and you're helping a company that you believe in, wherever it is, in the U.S. or internationally, and if it comes back later, it turns out to be $37,000 or whatever the numbers, it goes right back into your donor advised account. It's not taxed. So it's very tax efficient. And it filled a need for our family, which is in our opinion, And let me just step back for a second. What drove us down this impact investing lane was I studied the nonprofit world when I first left, and they have a stubborn giving curve that you may both be familiar with. And now that the amount of granting that goes on in a year is $500 billion a year. And that sounds like a lot of money, but the problem is that's down from 3 or 4% from last year. And when you count inflation, it's down 10%. And it really hasn't moved for over 40 to 50 years. And we have $1.6 million nonprofits trying to get grants from a pie that's not growing. And when you step back for a second, depending on who you listen to, there's $200 to $250 trillion worth of investable assets. So my brain was saying, I'm geared to think like a for-profit thinker. What can we do through businesses to do good in the world? So Impact Foundation became a conduit for us to invest through them so that we could invest in kingdom businesses or businesses that have, spiritual, social, and financial returns. And it was, it's critical. And anybody that's listening to it, if you have a donor advised fund, I would recommend, if you're interested in this, that Impact Foundation is a great solution.
Greg, you've also been a speaker for the faith-driven investor movement, and we'll link a video here. We'll link a video that you have done here.
Yeah.
But you talked about the 4 quadrants of faith-driven portfolio, and I can say I learned a lot from hearing that. Could you describe this for our listeners and share more about your family's movement in those quadrants? It's so very helpful for all of us to understand that.
Sure. It goes back to that 90-10 tithing discussion, which is once we had this event, we wanted to know how best to steward it. And so we felt this, that 90-10 was no longer fair. And so literally, Mary Beth, my wife, made me put in my prayer journal, Lord, help me get comfortable with giving all of our money away. And I'd have to say that it wasn't something I was excited to write in the journal because I was fearful that it may come true. And I wish I could tell you that days later it was all resolved. It took us a couple of years, literally, to say this is no longer ours. This is the Lord's. And when you cross that bridge and you really believe it, which it took me a couple of years to believe, I thought 90-10 was fair. And then once you believe that, your investing strategy and everything you do looks differently. You're not investing for yourself. You're investing through God's eyes. And he's not looking at the world the same way we are. So what happened with us is we had been investing for a handful of years. We weren't completely in the faith-driven movement yet because we didn't know that was still emerging. And so we started through impact investing, which was doing more social change. There was no spiritual component. And through the grace of God, we ended up connecting very early on with the spiritual side. So we graphed all of our investments, Lori, that we had at the time. And so for your listeners, a 2x2 is like 4 cubes. And on your bottom axis is the financial returns. And on your y-axis up and down is social and spiritual. So the lowest square in the lower left, we labeled each one, and we called that buried talents after the parable of talents. No one wants to be there, right? No one wants low financial, low spiritual. If you go to the right, we categorize that as capitalistic. And capitalistic is where 95 to 99% of the money is in the world. You're not caring about social or spiritual returns. You're out there investing in mutual funds and all that kind of stuff. Now you go to the upper right, which is normally the winning quadrant of all 2x2s. And that's where you have the highest financial return plus the highest social spiritual return. That's where you want to be. And we called that maximizing talents after the parable of talents. But then we had investments to the upper left-hand quadrant, and we couldn't understand why. Why would we be there? Because that's lower financial, but for the same lower financial with the same social or spiritual. So we labeled that after hours, days, and weeks thinking about it, called spiritual-led investments. And you cannot be in that quadrant unless you're led by the Holy Spirit, because there's always a financial investment that's better to the right. And so after much debate, we sat down and said, our family knows where the Lord is. And so I'll categorize this way. The upper right-hand quadrant is a beautiful quadrant to be in. And our goal as a family to have 50% in the upper left and 50% of the companies. So if we've invested in 100, we want to have roughly 50 in each. And upper right is easier. You can write bigger checks because they're a little stronger companies. Upper left, every check is hard. But I wanted to talk about the two differences. And we'll start from a biblical perspective is how we looked at it, which is Haiti would be a perfect example. I don't know that I saw Jesus every day until I went to Haiti. I literally saw him everywhere. I saw him with the poor, the underserved. They were praying over us. And what we know is that Jesus, invites us to be where he is. And the one thing we know, he's with the poor, the marginalized, and the underserved. We don't know that he's in the expensive suburbs of Chicago every day, but we know he's with the poor. And if we're not with him, we may miss him entirely. And so our faith in the Lord at this time now says, these are your resources. If I make an investment, our family does, in Africa, and it doesn't go well, but I was helping the marginalized and the underserved, and we did our best, I can sleep well at night. I'm not losing sleep over that. At the same time, the upper left spirit-led quadrants are where we're employing the marginalized. That's the honest truth. These are people that lack employable skills. They're returning citizens. They're undereducated. And we understand that going into it, and we're trying to help employ the marginalized. That's the center of our bullseye. So if you gave us an investment opportunity that only helped Ivy League people, no offense to the Ivy League community, we would rather help 100 people that are uneducated get a job because it's that much harder. Then the other thing about the upper left spirit-led quadrant is that these are companies that have great difficulty raising capital. There's no line of people running to give them money. And so we felt that we're capable of evaluating these businesses and supporting these businesses. And since on their side, when you listen to a private equity firm, and rightfully so, everything's about scale. In the upper left-hand spirit-led quadrant, everything's about sustainability and survival. We know there's not scale. We know that they're not going to come in and be bought out by the largest private equity firm in the world, but it doesn't mean they can't be a good running business. So most of our deals in that upper left quadrant are loans rather than equity, because you can at least get your money back with interest. And then the last thing is the difference between the upper right and the upper left-hand quadrant, the spirit-led quadrant, are the entrepreneurs themselves. The humility, the only serving the poor, the no ego. We're better for being around those type of people. They make us better. They're generally minority or female-led, and we find great fulfillment in that. So it's a complicated 2x2. So at the end of the day, at the top two, which are spirit-led and maximizing talents, we consider kingdom investing in both of those. We don't consider it just in areas that are giving the full financial return. We consider both because we believe that's how Jesus would do it.
And I would say that spirit-led is actually you guys having God's eyes on how he created all of us equally. He didn't create, we're all created in God's image. And those people that are marginalized, God loves just as much as he loves me. And it's really important to be able to, when we walk the streets of Haiti, is to have God's eyes in those seats, that these people are his people and he desires so much more for them.
Absolutely. And that really is the draw. Once you cross that bridge and say that these are not my resources, then you're thinking from Jesus's perspective, and you just can't tell me that he's only going to be with the profitable 20% IRR companies. It's just no way. And if it is, then we missed the boat.
Yeah, we had Rachel McDonough on the show a little while back.
And I heard her podcast.
Oh, yeah. One thing she talked about, I think, was leaving the edges of our investments, like you would a field, available for gleaning, and like the biblical principle that exists there. And I think I've heard Amy Minnick with the Impact Foundation have that same type of conversation. So that's that spirit-led, right? The edges of our investments that are for the ones that are underperforming. We might not get the return. We might not even get the return of capital. Hopefully we do, but there's a chance that we might not, and that's okay. And then we can balance that off with also the other top right quadrant. So I think we have a slide showing that 2x2, and it is something that's helpful to
Okay.
see. You've done a great job describing it, but I think we'll link it also into our show notes for guests so they could take a look at that as well, and maybe it'd be really a good exercise for you to take for me to take our investments and plot it on that 2x2 as well, and see where we land and see how God can help move us. Speaking about investments, last I heard, you've made about over 140 investments in 80 different companies that fall into these redemptive quadrants in the top tier. Would you give us a couple examples of some on maybe the top left and the top right quadrant that you're really excited about too, and that you're encouraged by?
Sure. Upper right, we have a decent amount of funds as well, Eric, up there. So I don't know if Sovereigns has been on, or Creation Investments, or Eventide, those types of things. So they're easier to get access to. But I'll reference two different ones that are direct deals that are harder. And upper right, this company is called Launch Capital Partners. And so they're trying to maximize talents. This means full risk adjusted returns, just like any other. Plus we get to social and spiritual. They are looking to support refugees and started in Louisville. The number one problem for a refugee is access to housing. And even though there's 150 settlement companies nationwide trying to help with that, only 15% of the landlords are willing to accept refugees as renters. So they've targeted just refugees. So they tend to build their facilities or buy their facilities around trains and transportation systems that are less desirable to other people, but yet very affordable to them. And then they have mission-minded, kind of like Apartment for Life, where you put in chaplains and stuff. They have mission-bent people that go in there and pour into them. So they have cookouts, language classes. They connect them on work. They're pouring the Bible study into them. They're pouring the Bible into them. They're tutoring, culture classes. And so they've created this niche that's affordable, very focused on refugees and helping them integrate back here into the States. And they get partnerships with churches and other things like that. So what we're excited about is they're looking to raise about $50 to $100 million in the next 24 months, I believe. They have an 8% preferred return, which means the investors get 8% back before they get any split on the investment. So it has the potential to be a 20% plus return. But at the same time, we're helping people, in this case, refugees that have great challenges coming in here to the States, and we're pouring into them. So they have great impact measurements. They track meals with tenants. They track gospel presentations. They track, are they connected to the church? And so we're very high on that investment. It's right in the center of our bullseye. Spiritual transformation, helping the marginalized, refugees in this case, and it has a good financial potential return. And so that's an upper right maximizing talent direct example. If we just move over to the left, now remember, as you move to the left of this quadrant, it gets harder. So when you go to this upper left-hand spirit-led quadrant, it's harder. And so one that we're very high on is called Pure Flow. And here's a couple of men that went down to Africa, and they noticed that there's 1 million boda drivers. And since Eric, you said you went to Haiti, a boda driver is a little motorcycle that takes you to and from like a taxi cab in developing countries, and they charge a small amount, and there's sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5 people on the back of these motorcycles, and they drive them a mile up and they pay a token, and they're called boda drivers. And 80% of them rent their bikes. And so what he came up with is a way to help them buy their bikes, motorcycles. And so for every 100,000 he gets in loans from people like us, he can buy 72 motorcycles and then create a leasing arrangement either from 12, 18, or 24 months. So they own these bikes, these motorcycles themselves. And so in addition, every Pure Flow person, very similar to Launch Capital Partners, are poured into. They meet once a week. They pour into them on the Bible. They read stories. They share stories. They talk about the community. And so there's this connection with the broader community. And this gentleman started with $6,000, bought 6 bikes. He said they drove off his lot, and he's going, I don't know if they're ever going to come back. And they came back. And so now, once they buy their bike, they can take home twice as much money as they were before renting it. And so it's a home run to us. Now, that one happens to be an 8% loan. We don't have equity. We don't want equity. And we're very happy with an 8% loan. I would tell both of you that it feels right to us because there's only so much you can charge them to charge people to buy these motorcycles to give them a higher quality of life. And so we have invested in them multiple times. The only thing preventing them from growth is additional capital. Whenever I tell the story to people, I say, would you rather earn 8% from something like Pure Flow that we're helping the bottom of the pyramid, or do you want to make 11% from a company you know nothing about that's making all their product in some foreign country? And for our family, this is a home run.
And the dignity that you're giving people to be able to have the ability to run their own business is just beautiful. And what an opportunity.
Lori, that's a key point. After doing this for 11 years, if I was to prioritize, the number one thing that surprised me is the dignity of work. If there's anything we can do to help create jobs, there's no greater thing to change the world than providing jobs. I think in a book I read that's about communities never been served out of poverty. The only chance that we have is to provide jobs for people at all economic levels. And I know we have drug problems and we have homeless problems, but at the root of all of those, in my humble opinion, are the ability to create jobs. You go down the wrong path when you don't have a job. I don't know what I would be like as a person if I didn't have the dignity of work. So this ability, something like Pure Flow and others, provides jobs for people that want to work.
I love it. I love it.
You're talking about redemptive investors, and heard you. We were both at an event for Talatin, which is an impact investing group that we both love. Their work that they're doing in Africa, and in it you talked about a staggering, disappointing statistic as it related to an article or a report done by the Global Impact Investing. And it was, I'm not calling you, I didn't tease this out to you, so you probably don't remember, but you said something along the lines of 33% of investors with a secular worldview, without a Christian worldview, are willing to take a lower return, even down to zero, if they believed in the cause. And then they asked the same question to believers, people who are professing followers of Christ, and only 17% of faith-driven investors were willing to take a lower return, even down to zero, if it was a cause that they believed in. Would you riff on that just a little bit?
Well, your notes are very accurate. That is true. I believe, if I had to double check, I think it's 18%, but I think I presented 17%. But it's still, the only difference, Eric, is it's faith. It wasn't just believers. Okay. So it's all faiths.
Okay.
So people of faith. And what you would think is if roughly 35% of the secular world is willing to take recessionary return for the right cause, you would think that faith-driven, including Christians, would. And in my experience, that's not the case. It's not the case with most of the people that are in this business. And I can't really point to it other than to say that when you're a secular person, you believe in the environment or you believe in this cause, and it's okay. And the Christian side seem to care more about the financial returns, and they want the social and spiritual. So this redemptive movement has started out of Praxis, which is a thought leadership organization in the Christian space that we think the world of. And they created this thought process that creative restoration through sacrifice. And so what that means to me is that if I'm running a business, I'm loving people, I'm caring for my neighbor, I'm giving glory to God, I'm dying to self, I'm running a company like that. But you're swimming against the current. And if you go back to our 2x2, the upper right hand, I normally show arrows going left to right. And whenever you're in the upper right quadrant, to go to the left hurts because you're always conceding something. And we were all trained in colleges and business schools that what you really want to do is take the least amount of risk over the shortest period of time for the highest return. If you can get a 20% IRR and it's even short, that's great. And what redemptive investing is just the opposite of that. You're taking higher risks over longer periods of time for expected lower financial returns. And some people say that's just bad investing. We don't seem to look at that. It's just because we're supporting someone that doesn't have access to capital and their idea is not going to be bought by a private equity firm for a 10 multiple doesn't mean that they're not employing people that are at the fringes that you brought up earlier. So redemptive to me is challenging because what I have on my slide shows when you move from maximizing talents in the upper right to spirit-led upper left, I show it as I sacrifice, we win. Meaning that's praxis terminology, which you have to intentionally want to do this. So this win-win philosophy we've grown up with our entire lives, you win-win everything. This is saying, no, I understand through the Lord's eyes, because these aren't our resources. I do want to help the people that don't have access. I do want to help the poor, marginalized, underserved, and that's a very wide bucket. And the only way to do that is through a redemptive lens. I know that there's better investments. I know that financially, but it doesn't mean it's not a better investment when you can include spiritual and social impact, the people that we're impacting. So redemptive is hard. And I understand, and we are blessed with resources. I don't want to come across as we're doing anything special because we're not. And if you have less financial resources, that's okay. There's other ways you can still do this redemptive work. But we would never, first of all, I want to make sure that everyone understands, I'm not a registered investment advisor. I think it's important that we're looking at this through a Christian lens of capital that we can afford to lose. And I think everybody's always said, don't invest in something that if you can't lose it, that you keep yourself up at night. I want people to understand that to be redemptive, it's something you're pursuing. If not, that's okay. God's not calling you to this particular way of investing.
That reminds me, I brought this up a couple times on our podcast before, but we have a pastor that says, live, and I'm going to use this word now too, I'm going to add to what he says, live and invest in such a way that it demands an explanation. And that's what I think you just described, moving from this win-win scenario to the I sacrifice, you win, is living in such a way that and investing in such a way that it demands an explanation. And I love the opportunity that we then have to say, well, this is why I'd be willing to do this. The heart that you have and the willingness that you have to say, this is why I'm willing to take this concessionary return. It's for the global impact that it can have on individuals in spiritual ways and also in social ways as well. So thank you for the work that you are doing. Really do. I'm encouraged by it.
Thanks, Eric. That was well said. That quote was well said.
You've given us a lot of great insights, but if you could catalyze this down, if somebody is wrestling with some of these ideas, wrestling with how they've been stewarding the capital that they've been entrusted to, wrestling with the investments that they're making, and they're kind of early on this journey, or they've been after it for 20 years, what advice would you maybe give to somebody who's listening in and wants to think differently?
Well, not shockingly, the first thing I would say is pray. It was what helped us. We wrote it down. We talked about it, and it took us a while to get over that hump. So it doesn't mean, in our case, we feel called to do this. It's not sacrificial. This I sacrifice, we win is a praxis term, which I understand, but we no longer think the upper left-hand quadrant is sacrificial at all. It's a pleasure. It's our passion. It's the ones we talk about. We never talk about the upper right. So the first thing I do is pray, and I write it down because then it has a whole different sense to it. And again, remember, I didn't want to do that. The first place I would start is with, if you have a donor-advised fund or a foundation and you have charitable capital, the best place to start is to use charitable capital. Because legally, if you're a foundation, you have to give away 5% every year. Focus a little more on that 95%, which is, in today's world, we have almost a little over 1.5 trillion in foundation money and donor advised funds. So if you remember early on, I said 500 billion is how much we grant away. We have 3 times that in donor advised funds and foundations that are no longer legally yours. Or if you're a Christian, you're saying, these aren't my resources. These are the easiest resources to try this type of investment. And so that would be the second thing I would do. An impact foundation is a great place to go. And I would also say, Eric, I would go into funds is the easiest place to start. You referenced a couple. They can, with a handful of calls, find 4, 5, 6 funds out there that may be attractive to them, whether it's in the U.S., but all Christian-led or with a focus on spiritual and social returns. And I think it's a great place to start. I think to do what we're doing direct investments, you need to be into it a little longer. And I would recommend that you do more than one, because a normal venture capital model has, if they invest in 10, they think somewhere around 6 are going to be zeroed out. They won't have any return, and they're looking for 1 or 2 that carry the entire fund. When you're investing in this upper left-hand spirit-led quadrant, we don't have any Google investments. We don't expect that, but we could have a lot of nice returns where that'll work out really well. But it doesn't mean we're going to get 100x. We're not investing from that perspective. So pray. Start with your donor advised capital or foundation capital, and then I would start with funds.
That's great.
It's a Christian-led funds. You brought up Talenton is one that's focused on East Africa, and we're high on.
Yeah, and you mentioned Eventide and Sovereign's Capital, which
Eventide,
are both fantastic.
Eventide, you can get through the public equity market. I don't know what their minimums are, but we've been in them probably for 8 or 10 years, and it's a wonderful Christian-led organization. And then Creation Investments is another superb one that's focused on East Asia and the microfinance loaning money to the poor. And it's done very well. Those are not concessionary funds, any of the ones we've referenced. Talented is, I'm sorry, but the other 2 are not.
We don't usually specifically necessarily even plug specific things that relates to NCF for whatever reason, just in our conversations. But since you brought it up, the Eventide is one of 3 different fund managers for NCF. And so if you have a fund balance and you have a donor advised fund at NCF, you can actually invest in faith-driven investment pooled options now. And Eventide and Caprock and Viatas are all fund managers of those, and there's no minimum in those, and they're fully liquid. And so it's a great way to even get started through a donor advised fund if it's housed at NCF.
Yeah, great point.
Greg, we just really appreciate the advice that you've given. We like to ask a lot of our podcast guests if they have a book or a podcast website that you would like to share with all of our listeners. Is there something specific to you that you would like to recommend?
Good question, Lori. I would recommend The Steward Investor by Don Simmons, which is a new book this past, I want to say 6 to 9 months. Very challenging. He's got some great quotes in there, and one of them is, it's easier to take a bone from a hungry pit bull than it is to get Christians to invest in faith-driven investments. So he challenges everyone's mindset there, and I found that to be a great book. Faith-Driven Investing, that was published last year by Tim Keller, Andy Crouch, and Henry Kasner, is a great book. But I'd probably do one podcast for those if you're blessed with some financial resources. Andy Crouch did a little presentation on you cannot serve God and mammon. I think you could Google Andy Crouch, you cannot serve God and mammon, and the evilness of mammon and how it's easy to take over our lives. Because I think Rachel brought it up in her podcast. In my experience now in this post world where we've had some wealth, it doesn't matter what your number is. Everyone wants more. And there's this evilness of mammon, and she brought up that, and same thing with investing. If you have 100,000, it's just critical that you have 500,000, and then it's 2 million or whatever the number is. And he does a wonderful job of talking about the evilness of mammon that's worthy of a listen.
That's great. We will actually link that podcast also in our show notes. And Don's book, you mentioned, he's going to be coming up on the podcast here real soon as well. And so go ahead and get it before he even comes on get it and read it before he even comes on the podcast. Yeah. And so that's a great resource as well. So thank you, Greg. Well, we really appreciate the time that you've spent with us. It really has been a joy. I pray for continued fruit in the labor that you and the family have in your investing and your strategies that you have, that jobs will continue to be created that will change the world for God's glory and the joy of many.
Wow, what a great episode. I want to thank you for tuning in and listening. If you're a returning listener, thank you for being along for the journey. If you're a new listener, we're glad you're here. Be sure to subscribe wherever you consume podcasts. You can even find us on YouTube. All of the information in today's show notes and links and resources mentioned will be listed below. And until next time, thank you, God bless, and we'll see you right back here on the Generosity Now podcast.